Imagine you're sitting in the front row of a lecture that most people never realize they need. Today, we're going to explore a question that changes relationships, identity, and personal power. What happens when an empath stops forgiving toxic people? This isn't about becoming cold, bitter, or vindictive. It's about understanding the psychology behind endless forgiveness, why toxic personalities depend on it, and what fundamentally changes when an empath finally decides that compassion no longer requires self-sacrifice. By the end of this talk, you'll see why one decision can completely alter the balance of power in every relationship you have. An empath rarely begins life believing that forgiveness should have limits. Instead, they develop an instinct to understand people before judging them, to search for pain behind harsh words, and to assume that every harmful action has a hidden wound beneath it. This ability is often praised as emotional maturity, but psychology suggests that empathy without boundaries can gradually become a pattern of self-neglect. The mind starts treating another person's suffering as more important than its own safety. Over time, forgiveness stops being a conscious choice and becomes an automatic response. The human brain is naturally wired to seek harmony. Conflict creates emotional discomfort, especially for people with high emotional sensitivity. An empath often experiences another person's anger, disappointment, or sadness almost as intensely as their own emotions. This phenomenon, sometimes associated with emotional contagion, makes it difficult to separate someone else's feelings from personal responsibility. Instead of asking, "Did they hurt me?" the empath asks, "What happened to them that made them act this way?" That subtle shift changes everything. Toxic individuals instinctively recognize this psychological tendency. They may not consciously understand the science behind it, but they quickly learn that empathy creates opportunity. Every apology, every emotional explanation, every promise to change becomes another reason for the empath to postpone accountability. The toxic cycle survives because understanding repeatedly replaces consequences. The more compassionate the empath becomes, the more predictable their reactions appear. Forgiveness transforms into permission, not because the empath wants to encourage bad behavior, but because hope keeps overriding evidence. One of the most powerful psychological forces involved is cognitive dissonance. When someone repeatedly hurts us, while occasionally showing affection or remorse, the brain struggles to reconcile these conflicting realities. Rather than accepting that a caring person can also be consistently harmful, many empaths unconsciously rewrite the story. They focus on moments of kindness, remembering the rare occasions when everything felt genuine, while minimizing repeated patterns of disrespect. This selective attention protects hope but weakens judgment. Another important factor is identity. Many empaths build their sense of self around being the person who understands everyone else. They become the listener, the healer, the peacemaker, and the one who never gives up on people. Eventually, forgiveness is no longer just something they do. It becomes who they believe they are. Saying no begins to feel like betraying their own character. Setting boundaries feels selfish, even when those boundaries are necessary for emotional survival. This creates an invisible emotional contract. The empath silently agrees to absorb disappointment, broken promises, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion because they believe love means endurance. Every act of forgiveness reinforces the belief that patience will eventually transform the other person. Yet behavioral psychology consistently shows that actions repeated without meaningful consequences tend to continue. When harmful behavior carries no lasting cost, there is little motivation for genuine change. Words become substitutes for accountability, and temporary remorse replaces lasting transformation. Gradually, the empath's emotional energy shifts away from self-awareness and toward constant emotional monitoring of others. They become experts at noticing subtle mood changes, hidden insecurities, and unspoken pain while becoming increasingly disconnected from their own exhaustion, resentment, and unmet needs. Their compassion remains active, but their internal warning system grows quieter with every cycle of forgiveness, making it harder to distinguish kindness from self-sacrifice and understanding from emotional surrender. Toxic people rarely begin a relationship by demanding unlimited forgiveness. Instead, they create it gradually through patterns of behavior that condition others to lower their standards over time. What starts as a small excuse becomes a repeated expectation. A forgotten promise becomes just a mistake. A disrespectful comment becomes a bad day. An act of manipulation becomes misunderstanding. Each incident appears isolated, but together they build a psychological environment where accountability slowly disappears. The toxic individual learns that every harmful action can be softened by an explanation, and every consequence can be delayed with enough emotion. This pattern is deeply connected to reinforcement psychology. Human behavior adapts according to the responses it receives. When someone repeatedly escapes meaningful consequences after lying, manipulating, or disrespecting boundaries, the brain learns that these strategies work. The behavior is rewarded, not necessarily with praise, but with continued access, attention, emotional support, and another opportunity. Over time, the toxic person begins to expect forgiveness not because they have earned it, but because previous experiences have taught them that forgiveness is almost guaranteed. One of the most common tools used in this dynamic is emotional justification. Rather than denying harmful behavior, toxic individuals often redirect attention toward their own struggles. They speak about stress, childhood trauma, anxiety, difficult circumstances, or feeling misunderstood. These experiences may be genuine, but they are frequently used to shift the conversation away from responsibility. The empath, naturally inclined to understand pain, begins comforting the very person who caused the emotional injury. The discussion quietly changes from "what did you do" to "how can I help you feel better?" Another psychological mechanism is intermittent reinforcement, one of the strongest conditioning processes ever observed in behavioral science. Instead of being consistently cruel, toxic individuals alternate between affection and mistreatment. After periods of criticism, distance, or manipulation, they suddenly become caring, attentive, and apologetic. These unpredictable moments of kindness create powerful emotional attachment because the brain starts anticipating the next reward. The empath remains invested, believing the compassionate version of the person is the real one, while dismissing repeated harmful behavior as temporary setbacks. Toxic personalities also become highly skilled at reading emotional reactions. They notice who values harmony over confrontation, who apologizes first, who struggles with guilt, and who finds it difficult to disappoint others. Once these patterns become visible, they adapt their behavior accordingly. They know exactly when to apologize, when to remain silent, when to become emotional, and when to make promises that restore hope without requiring lasting change. This is less about elaborate planning and more about learned social behavior shaped through repeated interactions. Another reason toxic people expect unlimited chances is that many relationships unintentionally teach them that boundaries are flexible. If every broken promise is followed by reconciliation, every lie by another conversation, and every betrayal by another opportunity, the expectation of forgiveness becomes part of the relationship itself. The toxic individual no longer wonders whether they will be forgiven. They begin assuming that emotional access is permanent regardless of their choices. Accountability becomes unusual, while forgiveness becomes predictable, transforming patience into an unwritten rule that benefits one side far more than the other. Empathy is one of the most remarkable human qualities. It allows people to comfort the grieving, support the struggling, and build relationships based on trust rather than fear. But like every powerful trait, empathy loses its strength when it exists without limits. When an empath believes that understanding another person's pain is more important than protecting their own well-being, compassion slowly transforms into self-abandonment. The intention remains noble, yet the outcome becomes deeply destructive because kindness without boundaries invites exploitation rather than mutual respect. One of the hidden costs of excessive empathy is emotional exhaustion. Unlike physical fatigue, emotional exhaustion develops quietly. It accumulates through countless conversations where the empath becomes the listener, the problem solver, the emotional caretaker, and the source of reassurance for everyone around them. They invest enormous mental energy trying to regulate another person's emotions while ignoring their own. After enough repetition, they begin waking up tired even after resting, feeling mentally drained after simple interactions, and carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to begin with. Psychologists often describe this as a gradual erosion of emotional boundaries. Healthy boundaries allow individuals to recognize where another person's responsibilities end and their own begin. An empath with weak boundaries unconsciously blurs this line. If someone is angry, they feel responsible for calming them. If someone is disappointed, they assume they must fix the situation. If someone behaves cruelly, they immediately search for reasons to excuse the behavior instead of evaluating its impact. Their emotional radar becomes so focused on others that it stops protecting the person who possesses it. This constant outward attention creates another dangerous pattern known as hypervigilance. The empath becomes exceptionally skilled at reading facial expressions, vocal tone, body language, and subtle emotional shifts. They can sense tension before words are spoken. While this ability appears impressive, it often develops from repeated exposure to unpredictable relationships. The brain learns that carefully monitoring another person's mood may reduce future conflict. Eventually, this heightened awareness becomes automatic. Instead of relaxing, the empath continuously scans the emotional environment, searching for signs of disappointment, rejection, or anger. The cost of hypervigilance is that peace becomes unfamiliar. Calm moments no longer feel normal because the mind expects the next emotional storm. Even healthy relationships may feel uncomfortable simply because they lack chaos. The nervous system adapts to unpredictability, making stability seem strangely empty. This explains why some empaths repeatedly attract similar toxic personalities. Their emotional instincts have become calibrated around managing dysfunction rather than recognizing consistency and mutual respect. Another hidden consequence is the gradual loss of identity. When so much attention is devoted to understanding everyone else's needs, personal desires begin fading into the background. The empath stops asking simple but essential questions. What do I actually want? What makes me feel safe? What relationships genuinely nourish me? Instead, every important decision becomes centered around someone else's emotional comfort. Their schedule, priorities, and even life goals slowly reorganize themselves around avoiding conflict or keeping another person satisfied. This pattern is reinforced by guilt. Many empaths have been taught that saying no is selfish, that prioritizing themselves is unkind, or that unconditional love requires endless sacrifice. As a result, boundaries trigger anxiety instead of confidence. Every attempt to protect themselves is followed by self-doubt. They wonder if they are being too harsh, too impatient, or too unforgiving. Toxic individuals often strengthen this guilt by accusing the empath of changing, becoming cold, or abandoning them, making healthy boundaries appear like acts of betrayal rather than self-respect. There is also a significant cognitive burden carried by empaths in toxic relationships. Their minds become occupied with endless analysis. They replay conversations, search for hidden meanings, predict future conflicts, and imagine better ways they could have responded. Hours are spent trying to understand another person's motives instead of accepting observable behavior. This constant mental processing consumes attention that could have been directed toward personal growth, creativity, meaningful friendships, or inner peace. Emotional energy becomes trapped in solving problems that only the other person has the power to change. Perhaps the greatest hidden cost is that repeated self-sacrifice quietly changes an empath's perception of love itself. Love begins to feel inseparable from pain, patience, and emotional labor. Respect becomes secondary to understanding, while reciprocity is replaced by endurance. The empath starts believing that relationships naturally require one person to carry the emotional weight for both people. Acts of manipulation become confused with vulnerability. Inconsistency becomes mistaken for complexity, and repeated forgiveness becomes interpreted as proof of loyalty rather than evidence of diminishing self-worth. The moment an empath stops forgiving toxic people is rarely dramatic. It does not usually begin with shouting, revenge, or an emotional outburst. Instead, it starts with a quiet shift in perception. The same apology that once inspired hope now feels familiar. The same promises that once sounded convincing begin to resemble rehearsed patterns. The empath no longer listens only to words. They begin paying attention to consistency, actions, and repeated behavior. This psychological transition changes everything because reality finally becomes more persuasive than potential. One of the first changes is the collapse of emotional illusion. Toxic relationships often survive because the empath remains attached to who the other person could become rather than who they repeatedly choose to be. Hope creates a powerful mental image of a future where everything is different. The empath imagines honesty replacing deception, respect replacing manipulation, and stability replacing chaos. When forgiveness finally reaches its limit, this imagined future loses its influence. The brain starts evaluating evidence instead of possibilities. Instead of asking, can they change? The question becomes, have they changed? That single shift transforms emotional decision-making. Another major transformation occurs in the nervous system. During prolonged exposure to manipulation or unpredictability, the body often exists in a state of chronic stress. Heart rate increases during conflict, sleep becomes inconsistent, and the mind constantly prepares for the next emotional crisis. Once the empath withdraws from this cycle, the nervous system gradually begins returning to balance. Silence no longer feels threatening. Distance becomes calming instead of lonely. The absence of constant emotional turbulence creates space for mental clarity that had been buried beneath years of anxiety and emotional overthinking. The empath also begins rediscovering trust in their own perception. Toxic dynamics frequently involve subtle forms of psychological manipulation that encourage self-doubt. Repeated denial, blame shifting, minimization, or contradictory behavior can cause someone to question their own memories and emotional reactions. Over time, the empath starts believing they are too sensitive, too demanding, or simply misunderstanding the situation. When forgiveness stops, this internal confusion begins fading. They learn to respect their instincts again. Feelings become valuable information rather than problems to suppress. Their inner voice grows louder than external manipulation. Relationships themselves begin to change in unexpected ways. People who respected the empath's kindness continue treating them with warmth because their connection was built on mutual respect rather than unlimited access. Those who depended on endless second chances often react very differently. Some become angry. Others become dismissive, sarcastic, or unexpectedly emotional. A few attempt to restore the old dynamic through guilt, promises, or sudden displays of affection. These reactions reveal an important psychological truth. Healthy people adapt to boundaries, while toxic people often experience boundaries as personal rejection because boundaries limit control. Another significant change involves decision-making. Before this shift, many choices were filtered through one question: how will this affect them? After the shift, a healthier question begins emerging: how will this affect me? This is not selfishness. It is the restoration of balanced thinking. The empath starts considering their own emotional safety alongside the needs of others. They become less willing to tolerate repeated disrespect simply to preserve temporary peace. Decisions become guided by values instead of guilt, making relationships more stable Because they are built on honesty rather than emotional obligation, there is also a noticeable reduction in emotional noise. Endless cycles of forgiveness often require constant mental negotiation. The empath debates whether they are overreacting, whether another chance is deserved, or whether things might improve next week or next month. This internal dialogue consumes enormous psychological energy. Once forgiveness is no longer automatic, many of these mental debates disappear. Clarity replaces confusion because the standards become consistent. Respect is expected, honesty becomes non-negotiable, and repeated harmful behavior is recognized for what it is instead of being endlessly reinterpreted. Perhaps the most profound transformation is that compassion itself begins to evolve. The empath does not lose the ability to understand pain or recognize human imperfection. Instead, compassion becomes wiser. They realize that understanding someone's suffering does not require accepting mistreatment. They learn that forgiveness and reconciliation are not identical, that empathy does not erase accountability, and that protecting personal peace is fully compatible with remaining kind. Instead of measuring love by the amount of pain they can endure, they begin measuring relationships by the presence of mutual respect, consistency, responsibility, emotional safety, and genuine reciprocity. Reclaiming personal power does not happen the moment an empath walks away from toxic people. It unfolds gradually through a series of quiet decisions that rebuild confidence from the inside out. After spending months or even years prioritizing someone else's emotions, the empath must learn to recognize their own needs again. This process is less about becoming stronger than someone else and more about becoming fully aligned with themselves. Every healthy boundary, every honest conversation, and every refusal to tolerate repeated disrespect becomes evidence that their life is no longer controlled by fear, guilt, or emotional manipulation. One of the first signs of reclaimed power is the return of inner peace. Toxic relationships often create constant emotional interference. Even during calm moments, the mind remains occupied with unresolved arguments, unpredictable behavior, broken promises, or imagined future conflicts. The empath becomes accustomed to carrying emotional tension everywhere they go. Once that influence is removed, silence begins to feel restorative rather than uncomfortable. Ordinary moments regain their value. Reading a book, taking a walk, enjoying a meal, or spending time alone no longer feels like an escape from chaos, but a natural state of emotional balance. Respect also takes on an entirely new meaning. In the past, the empath may have confused being needed with being valued. They believed that constantly solving problems, offering endless patience, or sacrificing personal comfort proved the depth of a relationship. With greater emotional awareness comes the realization that genuine respect does not require exhaustion. Healthy relationships are built upon mutual responsibility, consistent honesty, and consideration from both people. Respect is reflected through actions that protect trust rather than repeatedly testing its limits. Another powerful transformation occurs in self-worth. Toxic relationships often condition people to measure their value through usefulness. The empath feels important because they are always available, always forgiving, and always willing to help. When those patterns end, there may initially be uncertainty because the familiar role of emotional caretaker has disappeared. Gradually, however, a healthier understanding develops. Self-worth is no longer connected to how much suffering one can tolerate or how many problems one can solve for others. It becomes rooted in personal values, integrity, emotional health, and the quiet confidence that dignity does not require constant external approval. This renewed confidence changes the way the empath communicates. Instead of avoiding difficult conversations, they become more direct and more honest. Boundaries are expressed calmly rather than apologetically. They no longer feel compelled to explain every decision in excessive detail or seek permission to protect their own peace. Saying no stops feeling like an act of rejection and begins feeling like an act of clarity. They understand that healthy people respect clear communication, while manipulative individuals often challenge it because ambiguity once worked in their favor. As emotional strength grows, the empath also develops sharper discernment. They begin recognizing patterns instead of isolated incidents. Rather than focusing on impressive words, they observe consistent behavior. They notice whether someone's actions align with their promises, whether accountability follows mistakes, and whether kindness remains present when there is nothing to gain. This ability to distinguish genuine character from temporary charm becomes one of the greatest forms of protection because it reduces the likelihood of repeating old relational patterns. Another remarkable shift is the restoration of emotional energy. Time and attention that were once consumed by conflict, overthinking, and constant emotional repair become available for meaningful pursuits. Creativity returns, curiosity grows stronger. Friendships based on reciprocity receive more attention. Personal goals that had been postponed begin moving forward. The empath discovers that emotional resources are finite, and investing them wisely produces entirely different outcomes than endlessly pouring them into relationships defined by imbalance. Perhaps the deepest change is the realization that forgiveness was never meant to replace wisdom. Compassion remains an important part of the empath's character, but it is no longer separated from discernment. They understand that people deserve dignity, yet trust must be earned through consistent actions. They recognize that everyone has struggles, but hardship does not excuse repeated harm. They stop confusing endless access with unconditional love, realizing that love can exist alongside firm boundaries, accountability, emotional distance, and the unwavering commitment to protect the peace, respect, and personal freedom they worked so hard to reclaim.